I'm Nancy Sinkoff, the Academic Director of the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life and a Professor of Jewish Studies and History at Rutgers. And I am delighted to welcome you to this talkback with Keren Ben-Horin. Before I introduce her formally, I want to acknowledge, as always, Karen Small, the Managing Director of the Bildner Center and the Festival Director, 21 years. Karen is behind the scenes tonight. I also want to recognize Sarah Portilla. She's not on this call right now, but she has been instrumental and will continue to be instrumental as the film festival progresses through the week. And I also want to thank Hannah Feldman, who is one of our assistants, who is there if you have any tech problems. Let me tell you what we're going to do. I'm going to introduce Keren Ben-Horin. You are all muted. If you have questions, and I hope you do, please write them in the chat box, which is at the bottom. The chat icon is at the bottom of your screen, and I will be keeping track of those during Keren's talk. And then I will pose some questions to Keren and allow her to answer, and then we'll open it up to all of you. So again, welcome and good evening. What a great night to have a great talk about an absolutely fabulous film that's going to lift that has lifted my spirits every time I've watched it. We are really privileged to have Keren Ben-Horin here. Keren is a fashion historian, a curator, and an author. She's the co-creator of the documentary Mrs. G, which was adapted in part from her MA thesis on the life and work of Holocaust survivor Leah Gottlieb, who was the founder of the luxury brand Gotex. The film Mrs. G has been shown already in 20 film festivals around the world, including that great center of haute couture, Paris, that other great center of haute couture, Moscow, New York, another great center, and in Toronto, and here at the Rutgers Jewish Film Festival. Keren has curated several fashion exhibitions in New York and in Israel, and she has co-authored the Fashion History Survey, the title of which is She's Got Legs, A History of Hemlines and Fashion, published in 2014. And she's also editor of the book, The Sweater, A History, 2016. And she contributed an essay to the publication Fashion, Agency, and Empowerment, which came out in 2018. Because she's not accomplished enough, she's pursuing a PhD in history, in US history at New York University, and she's going to focus on the fashion industry and material culture. And we are delighted that one of her advisors, her main advisors, on the call. That's terrific, just to make Keren a little bit nervous. Keep her on her toes and keep her hemline straight. So it is my great honor and privilege to introduce Keren Ben-Horin to you. And as she speaks, we're going to have a slideshow in the background to give you some still images from the film and perhaps some that ended on the cutting room floor. So please, all of us, welcome Keren.
Thank you so much, Nancy. It's such a pleasure to be here. And, thank you so much for giving me this stage and this opportunity. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. All right.
The stage is yours, Keren.
Yeah, so I think it's maybe worth starting with like how this film even came to be. And that requires going back some almost 17 years or even almost 18 years now. When I was an undergrad student in Israel, I was trained to be a fashion designer. I worked as a fashion designer. One of my professors, Ayala Raz, which for those of you who have seen the film, she's the other fashion historian. She has bobbed white hair. She was my professor, and she asked me to help her with cataloging garments that Leah Gottlieb received in her apartment in Tel Aviv, that for those of you who watched the film, you could see this beautiful apartment. And at the time, it was a couple of years after she retired from Gotex, and she was receiving boxes upon boxes of garments and samples from collection, especially from the 90s and 80s. And together with Ayala and 4 or 5 other students, we cataloged the whole collection over a course of a summer. We photographed everything, we looked at everything, and eventually Ayala encouraged me to write an academic paper about Gotex, and Ayala was a mentor, a kind of mentor. She taught me how to do research, what's the difference between primary and secondary sources. And I ended up writing a paper on the influences from the art world on the designs of Leah Gottlieb. I then moved to New York, and I worked in the fashion industry. And after a few years, I started to kind of gradually focus more on kind of the research of fashion rather than fashion design. I was doing it in parallel, and I enrolled at FIT to get a master's degree in fashion history and fashion curation. And after my first year, I thought, there's hardly any scholarship, any academic research on bathing suits. Maybe at the time there were a couple of books. And I felt like after everything I found out about Gotex, and I do have to preface this by saying that I knew nothing about Gotex other than that it was a bathing suit company. I really didn't know anything about it. So before I was introduced to Leah and to her work. And so I thought, there's this brand that was global, very different, both in terms of business-wise, the business structure was very unique, but also stylistically, it was very unique. And I thought that now that I have even better academic skills, I can kind of go back and do a much more kind of in-depth history of the company and study both from the business side of it, but also kind of look at it in American context, in industry context. So I decided to write my thesis on it, and the stars aligned in a way that exactly when I finished and submitted and got my thesis approved, Ayala back in Israel was approached by Design Museum in Holon to curate an exhibition, a retrospective on Leah's work. And we only had 4 months to put the whole thing together. I was in New York, but luckily, because I just finished this huge research, in terms of kind of content and research, we had everything. It was really more about kind of selecting what will be exhibited. And Ayala worked in Israel with Sisi, who is also in the film, who was Mrs. G's personal assistant since the 1980s until the day she died. And so we did this exhibition together. It was really the first major fashion, if not the only fashion exhibition at the time in Israel to date. And after that, the JCC in New York approached me and asked if I will be able to bring a smaller version to their gallery, which I have. And because both of those exhibitions were kind of very quick, Ayala and I never had the time to really write a catalog. And exhibitions have this ephemeral qualities with them where, you get this experience and once they close, they close. And we really wanted to document our work and all those fantastic things that we found about her work. And we started writing a proposal for a book. And until then, and you can see a little bit in the slides, our approach to her work was very thematic. We always looked at the themes that she was inspired by. And I had this idea that instead of structuring the book around the themes of inspiration, we should maybe use her biography, which is very interesting, and structure the book around periods or points in her life. And the more we were writing, Ayala kept saying, you know, it really doesn't make sense to me as a book. It really should be a film, a documentary. And I was like, no, a documentary is too complicated, Ayala. I can't handle it. And she kept saying, no, I really think it should be a documentary. And that's how kind of the idea came to be. And once we decided that we will try to write a script for a documentary, something we have not done, either of us, before, things happened really, really quickly. We found Yali, and then the lead, Kimor, the director, came along, and it was very quick. I mean, the film, we started filming, I think a year or maybe a year and a half after we started writing. So very quickly for a documentary, very quick turnaround. I think 2 years altogether it took us to make the film, which I think the average with documentaries is like 4 or 5 years. Yeah, so that's kind of how this film even came to exist. And I think we had this really interesting combination of film people and scholars, and somehow I think together we created this magic.
I'm gonna unmute, and I'll ask some questions that will allow you to expand on a whole host of topics, and then again, as I said, we'll open up to the audience. I'm curious about how soon, when you were doing your research on Mrs. G, how soon you sort of understood that there was this very profound backstory to her life, and how you chose to handle that, both, I guess, in your master's and then in the film, right? The backstory of her European birth, the trauma of those years. So can you talk a little bit about how you decided to handle that very profound part of who she was?
Yeah, so I think it's a two-parter answer. So in my own kind of academic work, I found that her background, especially as an immigrant, but also as a survivor, was very important to the way she approached design. The kind of subject matters that were interesting to her, even the artists that she was drawn to their work as an inspiration, I think a lot of it had to do with those experiences. If we look at Chagall, for example, and she's done several Chagall collections, where and she uses this imagery from the Jewish village, kind of the family, the flowers on the table, the Shabbat table. All of that is very, I think, meaningful. However, in my work up until the film really focused more on her work. When the lead came along, and joined this project, I think one of the things that she contributed is kind of figuring out who this person was, figuring out her psychology. And we had so many conversations about what was the driving force here? What was the passion? Where was it coming from? And there is a very strong scene in the film where she recounts her visiting her husband at the labor camp, and she uses the flowers to kind of hide when she goes on the tram. And this was a kind of a point of some discussion behind the scenes, because when Ayala was doing, this is a story that Ayala and I came across when we were doing the research for the exhibition. We had a synopsis. At the time, we didn't have access to her testimony at Yad Vashem that you see in the film. But we had a synopsis that was written down by one of the people who worked for her at the time. So we had like this story, and Ayala suspected from the beginning that the story was a little bit weird. And she did a lot of back research on, and I have to say again, to emphasize that it was very difficult to do any research on the years before she came to Israel, because even the name of the town that she said that she was from, Ayala could not find that on the map. It took Ayala a really long time to find out even where she was born. The names changed over the years, the pronunciation were different. So in any case, Ayala researched that specific scene historically and came to the conclusion that it probably did not happen in the same exact way and time that Leah was describing. We think that Judith, for example, was born after Armin was dismissed from the camp. When we came to that scene in the film, which is a very kind of strong and emotional scene, Ayala thought that it was not ethical to show this scene, which in her kind of as an historian, her perspective on it as an historian is that we need to explain that maybe this is not exactly how it happened. But Dalit and I felt that it was true for Mrs. Gottlieb. It was true for her. And I also think that it's just what helped her after the Holocaust to really, it was a coping mechanism essentially for surviving the everyday, after arriving to Israel, this desire to make everything beautiful, everything should have flowers in it, everything should have beauty, even, the worst of memories. So, we had to kind of find a balance, both between truths and also with emotion, like showing sort of like who she was as a person, what was driving her.
I think that's always a challenge when you have testimonies or memoirs or any kind of memory culture. People remember things selectively. They make up things that then become true to them. It's difficult to unravel, the objective truth, if you will, the historical truth from her memory culture. But clearly, she arrived, from a Central European capital, right, from Budapest, like a great Habsburg city, and then to Israel, which, was very underdeveloped. I mean, she needed to create a persona and create a line and create a design. And she brought so many things with her to do that. And perhaps she didn't even realize half the time what she was doing.
And it's so interesting because I think there's so many like famous designers who have kind of made up their own biographies, like Lagerfeld and Chanel. And I think in that respect, she saw herself, as one of those people in every respect. So it totally makes sense to me that she would also embellish her biography in different ways.
Right. I mean, one of the things that's interesting, it's actually in the chat, but I mean, I don't want to get totally into the chat just yet, but which is, we think of some certain American designers, and you and I didn't talk about this, but, the Ralph Laurens of the world who are of Jewish immigrant stock and create a whole American mythos in their design. And here's Leah Gottlieb, who is creating an Israeli brand, but has, again, that immigrant need to create and the founding of the state. So we'll talk more about that later. I want to say something about the film. It is beautifully done, and congratulations to you, and such a joy visually to watch, and really allows the viewer to get a sense of the design palette of Mrs. G. But can you tell us a little bit about how you chose and your production crew to take the black and white reality, if you will, of 1950s photography and make it animated and colorized for a 21st century viewer? So, because it was incredibly successful, but not simple, I imagine.
Yeah, so that was another, I think, big contribution of Dalit as a filmmaker, that she sort of like used her skills, her storytelling through visuals to really, transform this story. She, very early on, we felt like animation will be something that would really contribute to this visual story. She interviewed several animators, and we ended up choosing a young animator. Her name is also Ayala Assur. And one of the reasons that Dalit chose her was because she works in a collage technique. So or a cutout technique, where she cuts different things and put them together. And Dalit and I had a lot of conversations in terms of like what this film would look like, and how also to express visually kind of I would call it kind of like the design aesthetic and the design footprint of Mrs. G. And she worked, I think collaging will be the most maybe accurate way to describe the way that she used to work. So, you saw a little bit in the film when we talk about sort of like how she gathers all of those sources of inspiration. She travels around the world, she collects art books, she goes to exhibitions, she buys samples from other designers, she goes to thrift stores, markets, and she sends other people also to collect for her. So collecting was a very big part of the design process. And then they will bring everything, sometimes suitcases upon suitcases with just design inspiration, because they used to make so many different groups with different inspirations. And then she would start putting those things together. And you can see that sometimes, collections will be named. For example, one of the slides that and I'll point it out when we see it, but it's called Topkapi, the palace in Turkey, but it's really, the actual inspiration, the visual inspiration is from Indian embroidery, for example. So it's like this, and it's not because she didn't know where things were coming from, but she was kind of very sort of like mixing, she loved mixing things, and they will start putting things together that seemed foreign, but for her, she created her own design language, essentially, from putting things together. And so what Dalit and Ayala did is Dalit would give Ayala material from Gotek's catalogs, from pictures of bathing suits, and Ayala really cut them out and created this animation using Gotek's designs. And one of the things that I maybe regret the most about the pandemic is that people are not getting to see this on the big screen, because even for me, when I first saw the animation on the big screen, all of a sudden I realized, oh my God, you could see in the daisies, for example, that the daisies that take over all of the screen, you could actually see the grain of the fabric. You could see that she cut it out from, photographs of garments, and it's just so gorgeous. And you could kind of really experience the textiles.
Well, there's nothing like the big screen.
Yeah.
There's really nothing more. We all hope we're going to get back to the big screen. So I have a question that's a little bit different, although it's sort of implicit in the film, which is the film is about I'm not sure what happened to the slideshow, but the film is about an extremely accomplished working mother. And there's tensions that get articulated by some of the characters by some of the protagonists in the film. And, I'm just wondering, given who you are, right? And I'm speaking, we working mothers of the world, that's something that, would we ask those questions of a man? Would we put his children on the stand and say he wasn't a good father, he wasn't home when I came home for lunch, kind of thing?
Right.
I'm just wondering if you'd like to reflect a little bit on that in terms of your and Ayala's and Dalit's, all working women, assuming probably their mothers as well. To what degree did you want to underscore that? To what degree were you ambivalent about that? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, so, I am proud to say that it was a film made by women, mostly. And, it was, I think that you're probably right. If she was a man, maybe those things would not even come up in the film. And it's definitely something that came up in each and every Q&A that I've done so far. And it's a very complicated question. It's loaded. I think if she have lived today, she probably wouldn't even have kids. She was a woman of her time. And I think, I told you that privately, but we, in this film, we really let each person that we talk to really tell their own truth, their own story. And we try to balance all of those stories and kind of give a picture of how people experienced her. And this is what came up. These are the things that came up. And different people experienced her differently. Sisi, for example, who, like I said, worked with her, she was like a daughter to her. She worked with her since Sisi was, I think, in
some
20s.
ways, it sounds like she was more than, when you say she's like a daughter. Sisi
Right.
was the woman with
the
wearing
gorgeous
the gray
hair.
and the great haircut. We've talked about that too.
Yes,
but she's in way more than a daughter, because she wasn't a daughter.
Exactly. She didn't have those baggages, like those childhood baggages with her. And she worked with her until the day she died. And after, she's still, involved. And she was also instrumental for my own research. She gave me a lot of the information, connected me to people. And Sisi loved Mrs. G, so much, and sees her as a warm, loving, caring person. The people that work there for decades. Some of them for 30, 35 years, their whole life, really. And they, I think at Gotex, there were no boundaries. There was no, this is a factory and this is a home. Everything was just one thing. And the same way that the people in the factory were not just workers, they were part of the family. And Armin and Leah used to buy in the suitcases that they would bring back from their travel, there was always one suitcases with chocolate for all the people working in the factory, like the highest quality chocolate to give out for everyone in the factory. On the same level, they also didn't treat their daughters differently than they would people that worked in the factory. So Leah really, I think, above all, had this, I don't know what's the right word, if it's a desire, if it's an addiction. Design was everything for her. I think I kind of mention it in passing in the film, but it's maybe worth repeating that if you look at her designs in even the first 2 decades or a decade and a half that she was a designer, the designers are kind of like unremarkable. They're beautiful, high quality, always have been, but they're not special. Something happens to her, like there's something kind of unlocks or kind of this creativity. She finds herself, and I think design gave her an outlet. It gave her meaning. It gave her purpose that she couldn't find in anything else.
Did she ever, it just struck me now in your, did she ever write about any of that, or that wasn't her, she just lived her life. She didn't reflect
No.
on, right. So
No.
you don't have it written.
No, when
I mean, that makes sense. She's a visual artist, but
right,
sometimes,
exactly. And I think like if you look at the designs, you can kind of see her whole history in there.
yeah. I mean, you mentioned this, and I think it's worth underscoring that it's really an immigrant story, and it's an immigrant story generically or generally, and then it's a specific Jewish immigrant story involving the 20th century and the Great Catastrophe and the founding of the State of Israel and everything that meant.
Mm-hmm.
So you're an immigrant.
I am.
So I imagine that it spoke to you. That aspect of her life spoke to you, right?
Definitely.
Right. So I'm going to ask you another question on that. I know you're working on your doctorate, but, and you've curated and you've, written books. Do you think there are other films in your future?
Actually, I hope so. There's actually another really interesting story that I'm hoping to make a film about. I can't say who it is yet.
Yeah.
But a family of a very interesting woman who worked in fashion in New York got in touch with me. They have an amazing collection of her. She's not a designer, but she was a fashion person, and there's this private personal archive that's spectacular. And she was kind of like a really interesting Jewish person.
Okay, good.
If there are anyone who wants to invest in a film, how to get to me.
All I can say is, we mentioned earlier that this afternoon we had a talk back with Caroline Link, and we've shown 2 of her films. So all I can say is the Rutgers Jewish Film Festival, we're very loyal to our talent. So we look forward to it. So look, Keren, I'm going to see what's in the chat, and then, we'll continue. So someone asked, are any of her grandchildren, so the grandchildren are Miriam's children, right?
And you did too.
Did you? Okay, so I'm not sure I saw those photos. Are any of the children in the fashion industry or design industry?
One of Judith's daughters, it works sort of like design adjacent. She, I think, works, I think she's in, maybe she designs store windows or something along those lines. I cannot remember, but one of them is. But Miriam's family, none of them are.
None of them is, right.
Yeah.
Some of this does run in families. I mean, artistic talent or visual culture.
Yeah, when I started talking to Miriam, years ago when I was writing my thesis and everything, and she told me that when they were little girls, they used to go and package bathing suits on every weekend.
Yeah.
And she said that until she was an adult, she didn't realize that was not something that everyone does on their weekends with their family.
Well, that's a typical immigrant story.
Yeah, and I think like for them, it was sort of like, it was a given that they will have to be part of the business and do this. Yeah.
So someone commented that the combination of trauma, Holocaust related, but not only, and family dysfunction is a familiar Israeli story in other industries, in banking, finance, pharmaceutical, media. So is Leah Gottlieb and the fashion industry sort of emblematic of this, or do you think she's an outlier? What do you think about that in terms of what we know about the modern state of Israel and its creation out of immigrant stories?
I think like in terms of the fashion industry in Israel, there was no one like her. or like the family, there aren't a lot of big family businesses like Gotex was. And for years, Gotex was considered kind of like this crown jewel of the Israeli industry and export. And Leah was pioneering, in that sense. And they were always aiming high, big. And I think she was unusual in every way, the way I see it, even in terms of the business structure. I mean, it was so unusual to have a company having this business structure, designing one big annual collection instead of like, small little collections throughout the year. The scale of the production, the scale of the design, the amount of resources, the sources of inspiration, the textile innovation, there was nothing like it.
Yeah. The only thing that seems typical of her is that she looks like a Hungarian Jewish grandmother. I mean, anyone who knows what Hungarian Jewish grandmothers looks like, Leah Gottlieb looks like a Hungarian Jewish grandmother. So someone in our audience is curious, how easy was it to get various celebrities who are in the still images and others how easy was it for you to get their permission for the film?
It was not complicated. It was not complicated. No.
Did you talk to any, I mean, you sort of mentioned, obviously Tammy Ben-Ami was her muse, but Claudia Schiffer and Tyra Banks and Princess Diana, of course. Did you talk to any of those models about Gotex or no?
We didn't. It was very hard to like reach the very, very big ones. We did interview one model. Of course, now her name escapes me, Carol. She was a famous Sports Illustrated model.
Well, there's Ella McPherson. And
her name is Carol. I forgot. Carol Alt. Thank you, Rebecca. Carol Alt. We did interview her in her amazing apartment downtown New York, but that interview did not make it into the film. At the end, we felt like the personal story was so much bigger, almost than not bigger than everything else, but we felt like we wanted to really tell a story from the perspective of the people that work with her and that were close to her.
Right. So I have, there's another question from the chat, but I want to ask you one other question that we kind of touched on in our conversation. I think some of our audience will really be interested. Nowadays, obviously products from Israel, if they're identified as Israeli, there can be pushback against them, right? From SodaStream to Halva or Trina. And here you have this moment in the history of Israel and the history of global textiles and the economy and things that I can't really speak to, but certainly in the film, you have an Israeli product, right, that hits the global market like gangbusters and sort of takes over the world. And at a time when there's beginning to be contestations or conflicts about the perception of Israel, the modern state of Israel in the world. So that's not really what you focus on in the film, but did that come up in any of your discussions or in talking to people? To what degree this was not only Mrs. G, but an Israeli product in the world?
It was definitely an Israeli product. I think, they, especially Mrs. G was always very proud that it was from Israel. It was never not said or hidden in any way. I think because her biggest market was the US, it was really not a big issue for her. And I think in other places around the world, there was not necessarily this immediate connection that it was an Israeli product, even though, the label is there inside. There was a period of time when the label said Gotex of Israel, but that was earlier. And I think once they really, really grew and became this global company that uses you know, these amazing models, celebrities. They went more for kind of like the, you know, the global high-end fashion image. But again, it was never not said that it was from Israel. It was never an issue for, I haven't not come up in my research in any cases where it was an issue.
It's interesting. It's interesting to think about, could there be a Gotex today in the same way? Well, I guess the Intel chip, but anyway. One thing that's come up in the chat, for those people who have seen other films already in the film festival, you'll notice that the basketball star, Ulcie Perry, appears in the film. He was the boyfriend of the muse of Tami Ben-Ami, and he figures in the film. So, you know, you've seen the film, Ulcie? Can you tell your audience a little bit about that? And did you know the whole connect? I'm wondering, actually, did you talk to him about this film? Has he seen this film?
I don't know if we've invited him. So Dalit and I met him actually at the opening of the Jewish Film Festival in New York. And we invited him to our screening. I don't think he came, but he was very touched to hear that she was gonna appear. I have to confess that I didn't even know he was still alive. I know it sounds terrible, but
no,
he was such a big star in Israel when I was growing up. And the two of them were, you know, this power couple that everyone admired and loved. And he was, you know, very, very loved in Israel and kind of disappeared.
Right.
And I was so touched by this film, and especially, you know, the parts about Tami. I think Tami merits a documentary film of her own. And it's such an interesting story. And from the Gothic's perspective, her relationship with Leah really changed Leah's design. And you could really see that. In my interviews with people who worked at Gothic's, people told me that she was such an inspiration. Her body was an inspiration for a lot of the designs. Her skin tone. When they did fashion shows, they used to send the other models to tanning salons to achieve the same tone as Tami, so they will all look more similar to her, or nice as a background to Tami, really. And the funny story is that the way Tami started to work with Gothic's was, there was a famous fashion journalism in Israel called Nurit Bat-Yaar, who passed away a few years ago. But she was like the big fashion person in Israel journalism in the 1960s and 70s and into the 80s. And Tami used to be the fit model at Gothic's. And Nurit took her to do an editorial on sweaters, ironically. And Nurit told me this story where Tami came and she had all this, like this really heavy makeup, and she kept telling her, like, remove. This was at the time when, you know, models did their own makeup. And she was like, remove more, you're so gorgeous, your face, your skin, you're so gorgeous, just remove more, until she almost had no makeup at all. And they took her pictures, and it ended up as a spread in Israel's leading newspaper. And all of a sudden, Gothic's were, whoa, she's amazing. Like her pictures she's so gorgeous. And that's when they started using her as a fashion model, not just a fit model. And you know, Leah loved the way colors looked at her, so that really drove her to use certain tones or certain types of colors. And she was really instrumental to Leah's design work.
So I don't think this is in the film. How did Tami, I don't know if this is How did she die? Was it
She
just
had
a
cancer. She had
she had
breast cancer. Yeah.
Right, right. And she died, and then Judith died, and then Armin. So it was like
Armin died. I think Armin and Tommy died the same year.
ah,
And then Judith died a few years later,
yeah, yeah, yeah. Wow.
also from cancer.
Yeah, wow. Well, I'm saying shout out to the audience. If you have any question, this is your moment to ask Keren Ben-Horin. I'm looking at the chat. Well, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. I want to thank you for making a super film that has all of the depth that a good history should have. And I congratulate you because as someone in the trade. Oh, someone asked, do you have a Gore-Tex suit?
I do. I have a few.
You have a few.
Yeah, yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
I'll tell the audience, I recently told a friend of mine who's in her mid-80s about this film because I think it's so extraordinary. And she herself is a curator, an amateur curator of kimono and fabrics. And she immediately looked in her closet and sent me a picture of her Gore-Tex suit. So I think I mean, I remember hearing about it as a child too. I don't have one. Of course, I now want one, but okay, one other question, two other comments. Someone says that she's worn Gore-Tex for years and have saved almost every suit and she loves them and she adored the film. And someone wanted to know if the Leah label, that secondary label, is that still active?
It's not
It's
that
not.
I know, no.
It's not. It's not.
No, when I was writing, I think yeah, I think they stopped doing it shortly after she passed away.
Right.
A few years
Well,
after.
as you also said, the global market, I think so much for those of us who are looking at the world, I mean, you know, everything in design has changed, continues to change. The Chinese market, I mean, you know, we don't need to go into it. Just it's a brave new world in terms of couture and any kind of boutique business and all those things. It was a moment,
Right.
you know, this 20th century moment that we're not in anymore.
Yeah, and I think, you know, there's something a little bit tragic, I think, in terms of her creativity. If you look at the Egypt collection, which was the
Amazing.
last
After
collect-
Sadat, after 79, right? Yeah.
No, I'm talking about like the last one that she did, the very, very last one. She went back to that topic several years, you know, several times during the years, but the very, very last one was came out in '99, which was the year that she retired. It was really, you know, she made it a year before, so it was her last collection. And in terms of both material innovation, design innovation, it's such an incredible collection. And I have handled those bathing suits myself, and the level of craftsmanship is mind-blowing, really it is. And to have that, to reach this level of creativity and making at a time when no one's interested in that anymore, it was irrelevant. The world was changing. People only wanted like solid, simple bathing suits, and you know, kind of that
H&M. Yeah.
Think about it. You know, it was even a little bit before, even just with like, you know, the Donna Karen look, the CK look, that kind of like clean 90s minimalist look. It was no longer relevant, and there's something a little bit tragic about that.
Yeah.
And I just want to quickly answer Professor Mitchell's question about the price, because this is something that comes up quite a bit in my Q&As. I think I want to say like that in the 80s and 90s, or like early 90s, I would say the average was probably like 160 or 180, something along those lines. So it was expensive.
Right.
It was expensive.
Yeah. Well, we await your next film. We await your dissertation, which we've talked about. And really, thank you so much. It's an enlightening film. It's a visually stunning film, as I've said. And it documents a woman who deserved, I mean, to think that there was no real fashion history of her, or no one knew the backstory of Leah Gottlieb. It's amazing. It's just, and her story is amazing for all of the poignancy of it. So, Toda, good evening, everyone.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. And everyone out there, you know, we have many other talkbacks this whole week. So tomorrow I'll be talking to Yaakov Yadgar about the Israeli TV series Autonomies. And right now my brain is whoop, so I can't remember what else is tomorrow, but Karen Small we're actively talking to directors and filmmakers and researchers. So please continue to join us. And we look forward to seeing you in person soon. So good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen.